Yeah, good evening, everyone, and nice to see you. A nice turnout for our EIS flagship event today. I'm Isabel Hörtner, and I'm chairing this debate, but first of all, I'd like to welcome the Dean of our faculty, Professor Linda McKee, to say a few words. So thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to introduce to this evening's debate. And I'd like to start by welcoming colleagues to the faculty and to the Department of European and International Studies, one of two departments in the School of Politics and Economics. Now, as Isabel's already said, my name is Linda McKee. I'm the Executive Dean for a faculty which actually delivers 16 undergraduate programs, 48 postgraduate programs, has over 8,000 students and 1,100 academic and professional services colleagues. So we're actually quite a large entity. But if there's one thing that connects us, it's our interdisciplinary work, and within that, our work on international relations and geopolitics. Now, Europe and Europe's relations with the world matters a lot. If you had time today and you looked at the BBC News website, you will have seen a highlighted report from Katja Adler, Europe editor, entitled "Trump's New World Order has become real and Europe is having to adjust fast." So, very timely debate this evening. As the Munich conference has drawn to a close and all the associated meetings are also running down, we appear to have a lot of debates ongoing about short-term mechanisms designed to survive Donald Trump. But are closer alliances outside the continent of Europe liable to be longer lasting? These are all debating points, and certainly they're areas where we, as researchers and educators, as students, can have an impact. Now, a little bit about the faculty's engagement across research, education, and impact in this general area. We undertake a lot of research about Europe, as well as partnering with European organizations and obviously receiving European funding. And one key example for us is the 10-year partnership with Sciences Po in Paris, a double degree master's in international affairs. And students on this program are at the heart of Franco-British cooperation on European security, defense policy, and diplomacy at a time when France and the UK remain central to Europe's leadership. We also have a dual master's in policies and governance with Lewis in Rome. Now, over the years, colleagues in EIS and other departments across the faculty have provided specialist education and training for institutions such as the Government of Malta, the University of Gibraltar, the Norwegian Defence University College, and the Geneva Centre for Security and Governance. We're an institute that actually works with the range of capacity-building organisations which are concerned about peace, conflict and security more generally. And we have a raft of student exchanges ongoing across Europe too. I've just come from a meeting this afternoon where we were discussing the revitalisation, fingers crossed, of the Erasmus programme. And I think we're aware that our Circle U European University Alliance is actually quite central to that work as we deliver joint research projects, PhD networking, educational activities, etc. Now, in January, we hosted the European Union's Special Representative for the Gulf region, His Excellency Luigi Di Maio. And he was discussing Europe's relations with the Gulf in the context of Trump's second administration. And our Vice Dean International, Elisa Carver-Torta, personally conducted the fireside chat. Now, he stayed after that event and spoke with students and staff. And I think that demonstrates our commitment as an institution, as a faculty, as a department, to ensuring our students have the highest level of exposure to key European policy debates and to decision makers who are actively shaping Europe's external and security relations. Now, as I've already said, the faculty benefits from funding sources, from transatlantic platform projects, and of particular note is one project on the fundamental values of higher education in all the countries of Europe, minus Belarus and Russia. Now, the 6 fundamental values in this project are academic freedom, integrity, institutional autonomy, public responsibility for higher education, and public responsibility for higher education. Now, a report on these values will be published in autumn of 2026. Perhaps it's timely for us to return here later this year or early next. And our colleague, Professor Livu Matai, is working on various dimensions of this project. But as I close my welcome, I'd like to start by thanking Professor Ramon Pachero-Pardo, who stood down as head of department in EIS in November and led the department through a period of notable growth, and to welcome Professor Nick Mickelson, who is now our interim head of department. Along with thanking colleagues in EIS and obviously our panel members tonight, I'd like to add that combined, they and you as an audience ensure that we remain and continue to grow as an intellectually inquisitive community, open to debate and sometimes some very challenging debates. So thank you, and over to the panel. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me here? Yeah. Thank you very much, Linda, for your warm welcoming message. I'm now going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. Every speaker is going to have 7 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from you. And after that, it's time for a little drink reception. So the first speaker is Professor Nicholas Mickelson, here to my right, who's a professor of international relations in the Department of War Studies here at King's and currently head of department in European and International Studies. Nick's research focuses on the changing international order and with a focus on the rise of reactionary internationalism and on the impacts of climate change. So he's currently the principal investigator of a research grant from the ESRC on the international relations of tropical storms in the Caribbean. And that's a research collaboration with the University of the West Indies. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Ruth Diamond, here to my left, who is a senior lecturer in post-Soviet security in the Department of War Studies. And she's an associate editor of the European Journal of International Security. Ruth previously worked for the Treasury in areas including UK policy towards international financial institutions. Here at King's, her primary research expertise is in Russian foreign and security policy, and particularly in relations to Europe and the US, but also the former Soviet Union and also US foreign policy. So Ruth is currently involved in a project that analyzes UK-Russia relations for the UK Parliament. Then further to my left is Professor Christoph Meyer, who is a colleague of mine in the Department of European and International Studies. Christoph's research interests are at the intersection of European Union studies and international relations. And in terms of policy fields, he has published widely on security and defense policy, including conflict prevention, public communication and media coverage, as well as economic governance. Christoph has provided advice to the House of Lords and also the German government's Enquete Commission on Afghanistan. Finally, Further to my right is Dr. Hilary Briffa, who is a senior lecturer in National Security Studies Education, also in the Department of War Studies, and she is the Assistant Director for the Center of Defense Studies here at King's. Hilary's thesis asked whether small states can have a grand strategy. And following this, she conducted research on the role of small states and maritime security and climate security. And Hilary also regularly consults for the British government. So as you can see, this panel brings together colleagues from the Department of War Studies and Department of European and International Studies. We're all in the same faculty, and it's nice to see everyone here on this panel today. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you so much for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, I think it's all right. So Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea starts with the story of an old fisherman who, after 80 days without a fish, is forced to go out to sea without the boy who normally accompanies him. Starving, he sets out to hook a great marlin. Larger than his small boat, he endures, cuts to his hands, and untold days in battle with the elements until he succeeds. Dragged far out to sea by this great fish in his tiny little boat, he turns home having caught it. But piece by bitter piece, all the way home, sharks eat it. And by the time he reaches Havana, all that remains is the bony spine and tail fin rattling in the harbor as he crawls home to collapse still, starving. So I'd like to imagine, or us to all imagine ourselves standing in the harbor, Europe that is, looking at the rotting bones of our vision of international security. Our European foreign and security policy paradigm has, since the end of the Cold War, been grounded in an appeal to a series of universals: multilateralism, international law, rule-based trade, human rights, relying on a US security umbrella which accepted these principles rhetorically, but held, in a sense, abeyance the idea that it itself would be in some way restrained by them. From Europe's perspective, this was fine. That's because in Europe it was assumed that international order moves only in one direction, that rules become denser, more entangled, more universally accepted, progressively institutionalized, and that the alternative to a rule-based order was no order at all. This was, of course, false. Right? Everyone can now see that Europe faces a robust alternative paradigm of international order. And Trump's second presidency matters because it explicitly represents that alternative on the world stage, articulated actually with some clarity by Marco Rubio in Munich just this week. Framed as a response to geopolitical competition, this is in fact a diplomatic compact that has emerged between a whole series of new right populists across Europe and across liberal capitalist democracies in the United States, in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in India, in Brazil, and a series of authoritarian nationalists in states like Russia, China or Saudi Arabia. These actors all explicitly in their foreign policy discourse and security discourse share a common and clearly articulated desire to dismantle the historically emerged, quite complex network of norms, of international norms that shaped international society to date. Particularly, they're interested in the unraveling of a series of norms relating to legal rights and rules-based multilateralism. And what they want, and this is very explicit, they would like to replace them with a simpler model of international order, a three-part model. They want to see birth culturally grounded sovereigns engaged in transactional deal-making and producing spheres of influencing around those cultural domains. This is a consolidated model of internationalism rather than an anti-internationalism. It echoes, or has clear echoes, with the international order within Europe of the late 18th century, which broke down, of course, as an effect of Europe's expansion, imperial expansion into the non-West. This vision of international order rejects the architecture that the United States itself created to sustain its power and hegemony after 1945, which is fascinating in and of itself. But we should also recognize that in this new model of international order, America retains the right to kinetic violence within a particular domain of its sphere of influence. So if you'd been that fisherman leaving Havana in Hemingway's story, you now have to worry about being bombed in case they decide you're carrying drugs on your boat. These new internationalists seek to re-engage the international on different terms. They want to see a multipolar world of ethno-cultural zones of influence, the Rusky Mir, the Nine-Dash Line, and American Hemisphere. These birth cultural zones may collaborate through transactional deal-making only. By all these actors, the liberal project is represented as an extended effort to erase cultural identity and national distinctiveness. Human rights are recast as an imperial epistemic overreach. Look, the degree to which this strikes Europe as a problem should be recognized as a philosophical one. It is a philosophical shock to the core normative assumptions that have governed Europe's idea and ideal of security. The liberal order rested on American power and, I guess, post-imperial Western cohesion. Its collapse has probably been coming since 9/11, and it leaves Europe facing some seriously difficult policy choices. First, Europe must recognize the systemic nature of the challenge to its model of international security. And this is rooted in really one core idea, the idea of pacta sunt servanda, probably the oldest rule in European international order, the idea that the norm, that is, that deals that you make with other international actors should be honored. This is explicitly rejected by all the actors within this new system, particularly explicitly rejected by Trump in his second presidency. So having moved very decisively towards transactionalism, this really creates a huge long-term strategic challenge for Europe in thinking about how it's going to negotiate and engage with the United States going forward on absolutely any issue. Right, so the question of strategic autonomy is now a necessity for Europe. That means defense capability, industrial resilience, energy independence, and institutional capacity to act without guaranteed US backing. Britain will, of course, now have to collaborate more with Europe. This is an inevitable consequence of the breakdown in pacta sunt servanda, this direct consequence, because you can't fundamentally plan around an alliance that doesn't stick to deals you make with them. Second, and I think perhaps more importantly, Europe must avoid mirroring the logic that it seeks to resist in thinking about security in the future. The temptation is already visible, I think, in the claps that Marco Rubio received in Munich, a turn to European values, to cultural rhetoric, to the geopolitics of identity. If Europe acquiesces to the call to define its foreign policy and security paradigm as a defense of its civilizational sphere, it concedes effectively the central premise of the new internationalism, that order should be organized around culturally defined blocks. Europe must become more capable without surrendering to this new rising cultural politics. That requires quite a disciplined form of pragmatism, to defend borders without abandoning asylum law, to invest in defense without normalizing spheres of influence, preserving institutional commitments over identitarian logics. I think also older arguments about the value of liberalism need to be dusted off. And here lies, I think, the uncomfortable truth for us in the academy. Many of the critiques weaponized by liberal actors were developed and articulated within liberal societies themselves, in our academies and public discourse. All visions of universalism were described as imperial, as culturally colonial, as racist, intended as a self-correction. These critiques are now being re-weaponized by our opponents. We fed, in its sense, the anti-globalist sharks their sharpest teeth. The question before Europe is not whether the rotting carcass of the liberal international order was perfect. It obviously was not, nor was the rhetorical fiction that we or the United States followed our own rules an innocent one. They weren't innocent. As Kissinger said in one of his last interviews, he described the emergence of Trump as the emergence of a kind of leader who appears only at the end or of a dying order. He said that, what happens is this forces the order to give up its old pretenses. And I think that is right. But the tragic, endlessly failing pursuit of an international security order grounded in universal rules, in laws, in multilateralism, and in rights, rather than a vision of cultural nationalism, civilizational identity, and transactions of brute force. For us in Europe, this was a hard-won historical lesson. Right? This didn't come without any context. If we try surviving in Europe and securing ourselves based on cultural or civilizational discourse, millions will die in our lifetimes. Right. So the question is whether Europe can secure itself without replicating the cultural internationalist tendencies rising around us as they violently clash, or will we participate in a war amongst the spheres? I am not, I have to say, entirely hopeful, but I think we have to retain some degree of hope.
Thank you very much. So, over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Can I just, before I start, anyone at the back who wants a seat, there are quite a lot of seats at the front if you want to come and make use of them. So I'm going to make 3 points, but I'm going to start with a broader comment on the Trump administration foreign policy. Actually, two connected comments. The first is that Trump foreign policy, as it's generally referred to, is actually Trump administration foreign policy. Trump himself, I think it's fair to say, is less engaged in both foreign policy detail and American grand strategy, if there is still such a thing, than any previous president. Trump lacks basic interest, knowledge and understanding, and I would say capacity, therefore, to engage in foreign policy. And this is true to a degree that has never been true in US history before. And this means that policy really is being shaped and driven by powerful people around Trump rather than Trump himself. He really just, I think, puts his name to things. But Trump does have some interests in foreign policy, interests that are shared with the people close to him, including the two key interlocutors with Russia, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff, his envoy. These interests are almost wholly transactional, as Nick was saying. The focus is on private enrichment and on personal status. Trump's bizarre obsession with being given the Nobel Peace Prize, for instance, but also being able to get credit by putting the stars and stripes on new bits of territory. And I think actually in these ways, the president's kind of a disengagement, incapacity, and the focus on personal enrichment around the presidency, all of them recall much less previous US presidencies and much more the second term of Boris Yeltsin in Russia in the 1990s. And that raises some very uncomfortable questions for the US. But my three main points are on Ukraine, on Russia, and on European security as a result of them, Trump policy towards these things. My first point is that for the Trump administration, Ukraine is a means to an end, or several ends, nothing more than that. Ukraine policy is a reversal of all post-2014 US policy towards Ukraine, including the first term of Trump himself, although Trump personally was much more of the approach that we can see now. It's also an abandonment of 33 years of at least theoretical commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, to its territorial integrity, and to its right, if it wishes and meets the criteria, to join NATO. The Trump administration wants Ukrainian capitulation. It's not seemingly interested in any other end to the war in Ukraine, not interested in an end on any other terms. In this context, I think it's important to be clear that when the Trump administration talks about a peace deal, the peace deal they're talking about is not a deal for peace between Ukraine and Russia, but between Ukraine and the United States. And it's a deal in which the Trump administration envisages the US getting Ukrainian assets, Russia getting Ukrainian land, and Ukraine getting to shut up and take it. The view of Ukraine merely as territory and assets to divide between powerful states also reflects the administration's worldview, and this is a world in which only great powers have agency, and the world is divided into spheres of interest, an entirely illusory view of contemporary international relations, I have to say. But as all this suggests, the US under Trump, the Trump administration, is no longer aligned with the rest of the West in its policy on Ukraine. It's aligned with Russia. And when we think about what are incorrectly described as peace negotiations, since they're not negotiations and they're not going to lead to peace, we need to understand everything that happens in those negotiations in that light. The Trump administration is entirely indifferent to the effects of either the ongoing war or Ukrainian capitulation on either Ukraine or wider European security. My second point is that the Trump administration sees Russia not as a threat, but as a like-minded ally. Historically, Trump personally has focused on getting along with Russia. It was one of the few great foreign policy preoccupations of his first term, indeed before that. But what we see now is more than that. The Trump administration is deeply preoccupied with creating a strong economic partnership with Russia, including in both Ukraine and in the Arctic, despite the alleged concerns about Russian activity in the Arctic we saw most recently. But it's still something more than that. The Trump administration and the Kremlin have shared or overlapping worldviews, really views on almost all areas of international relations. They have a shared view of world order, of great powers, the world divided into spheres of influence. They have an indifference to international law, an indifference to state sovereignty. They share a view that the use of force is legitimate if you're powerful enough to get what you want. They consider human rights to be irrelevant. They consider Europe to be a cultural threat, a cultural opponent. And they share an interest, bizarrely, in seeing Russia as a great power. This is something that Trump has been pushing, again, since his first term, with the idea that Russia must be readmitted to the G8. The Trump administration has reversed 33 years of more or less serious attempts to encourage Russia to align with the West, and specifically with the US, and it has instead aligned the US with Russia. This, I would say, is the single greatest change in US foreign policy since the end of World War II. Finally, because of these changes in relation to Ukraine and Russia, and what they tell us about US intentions and priorities under the Trump administration, the current US foreign policy is creating the greatest threat to Europe in at least 40 years, since the second peak of the Cold War. The US is now much more closely aligned with Russia than with Europe, despite the fact that Russia is a state that sees itself explicitly as in perpetual existential war with Europe. The US is clearly no longer, in any sense, a reliable NATO partner. It's not only indifferent to European security, but particularly if you're Denmark, it's a threat to it. And all this means that European security, the European security order since World War II, is done. It's dead, right? Europe can no longer treat the US as an ally, and it means that they need to rethink European security. We need to rethink European security. And this will remain true when, or perhaps if, the Trump administration ends. Waiting it out until the next election or the next administration is not a viable strategy. So Europe and Canada need to develop security without the US, and there are finally signs that it's happening. I don't actually take the clapping at Munich of Marco Rubio as symptomatic other than anything other than a desire to be polite, more or less. This will be catastrophic for US standing and US security, but I'm afraid that's no longer Europe's problem.
Yeah. I mean, as academics, we're supposed to make sense of what we're seeing in the world. We're supposed to make sense of decisions taken by leaders. And I think it's no underestimation to say that the last year, certainly since the election of the second Trump administration, have really challenged quite a lot of our theories about how decisions are made and what the preferences of leaders are. So I think we've been scrambling to understand what has been happening because it was contradictory to what most realist theories would say the US should be doing. It's contradictory to research on security communities and trust in the so-called transatlantic political order. There's a resurgence of theories about kind of narcissism in foreign policy and about, the role of populist spillover to foreign policy, the kind of ideology that is developing at the domestic level and is suddenly influencing foreign policy in ways that we didn't anticipate. So this is a challenge, I think, to academics to make sense of. But I think it was also clearly a disruptive emotional challenge for leaders. Who felt that their trust had been betrayed, and that creates emotional reactions. So if you think about the different scenarios, the Trump administration talking about Canada becoming a US state, taking over Greenland, potentially with using military force, Canadian intelligence services starting to model a military attack on their country. Allies wondering whether the F-35 they are buying could be switched off in Washington. I mean, these are really major disruptions of trust and creating perhaps well-evidenced distrust in the US. So, and Europeans sending kind of tripwire troops to Greenland, unprecedented things we couldn't have imagined 12 months ago when, yes, Europeans were expecting to be called, free riders, and yes, the greatest risk was abandonment. But now it turns out that the US may not just be interested in more European spending, but they're interested in the end of the European Union. They want to bring the European Union to an end. They want to divide member states amongst themselves, and they want to bring about a kind of right populist revolution in a number of member states. And they interfere actively. They've interfered in the Polish presidential election. Of course, US representatives now in Slovakia and in Poland, in Hungary. So there's an active, hostile agenda by the current administration. Now, put it in a different way, if there was a rupture in NATO, a deep rupture in transatlantic relations where Europeans were just saying, goodbye, we've had enough of you, we do our own thing. That would be the greatest victory for Russia. That would be the kind of strategic outcome that Russia would want. So I think it's wise for European leaders to still hope for the best, but plan for the worst. The problem being that you don't know what the worst is. And the worst has been shifting. The imagination of worst case scenarios has been kind of escalating. And you don't know precisely what it is that you should be de-risking from. So everyone is saying, you need to be more resilient. I mean, you don't really know resilient against what. And I think it also underplays the degree to which the US, and particularly US Congress, public opinion, is still receptive to Europe. So there's some leverage that Europeans have. And the big question is really whether the US will still be a democracy in a year's time, whether the midterm elections will take place, whether they will be renationalized or interfered with. So I think that is the biggest question for the relationship to the US, whether the US stays a recognizable democracy. And Europeans actually have some influence over that outcome, how they are standing up. And I think that was the message of Democrats at the Munich Security Council, Security Conference. Now, what is it that Europe should do in that case? So I think more rigorous future thinking about these different scenarios and planning for different types of futures, and making wise decisions around those. Secondly, I think there needs to be a bit of leaving behind of the psychology of dependence and weakness, and thinking for yourself about what are your strategic objectives, what is it that you want, rather than second guessing about what Trump may say next. So what are the strategic objectives vis-a-vis Russia? So I would say the strategic objective is to make sure that Russian imperialism as a threat is deterred in the short term and defeated in the long term. That should be Europe's strategic objective. And that is a long-term objective, and it needs credibility, it needs resilience, it needs capabilities. Secondly, it's about making sure that liberal democracy in Europe survives, and that there is sufficient solidarity and trust amongst Europeans to make that happen. Because collectively, Europe is strong enough to deal with both the US and stand up to China and navigate a course between them. However, if Europe was divided, it will fall. It will be picked apart, and it will be will be on the menu. It will be the theater on which other great powers will be playing. So for the EU, I suppose the question really is, and for Europe more broadly, the question is, how do you build trust? And how do you build trust amongst the right kind of partners? Because within the EU, there are clearly countries who don't share the threat perception with regard to Russia. There are some countries who have been undermining the EU. So I think one of the challenges is, how do you create sufficient trust, for instance, to coordinate defense spending in a wise way, so that it's no longer about, protecting your national champions, jobs at home, but really a kind of coordinated approach to spending more wisely. Because I don't think Europe, on its current trajectory, is not spending enough. It's about spending more efficiently and smartly. And secondly, it is about the solidarity and trust amongst each other, that if you are sending troops to Greenland together, you mean that. And if one of them is attacked, you will come to their defense. And you need to be able to signal that solidarity credibly, both to the US as well as to Russia. With the US, I think it was interesting that Trump caved in after the EU's anti-coercion instrument was mentioned. And I think Europeans were kind of moving towards that kind of use. So I think trust is a very central element with regard to building that solidarity and that support and kind of making cooperation work. I think the EU has a very critical role to play in terms of mobilizing funds for Ukraine, mobilizing weapons, the SAFE program, sanctions, technology. So I think the EU, everyone is realizing now, is indispensable for defense. This is no longer just about NATO. This is not just a military thing. It's about economies, it's about technology, it's about societal resilience, and the EU is absolutely central to making that happen. But at the same time, it's clear the EU is not enough. So I think that's where I think the UK leadership is critical. So kind of coalitions of the willing, but not with everyone on board, but with those who are capable and committed to each other to build that sense of a momentum and to show some real leadership and strategic direction. Because I think everyone has also realized now, or should have realized by now, it's not good enough to just have kind of frantic diplomatic initiatives to whatever comes out of Washington. You need to chart your own course. And for that, you do need a degree of institutional coherence and a degree of real European leadership. And I'm actually fairly hopeful that we're kind of moving in the right direction now. So I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm sitting up here feeling kind of torn between being so happy I'm here with these colleagues and so depressed by everything we're talking about. And I think it's going to be a little bit ironic that I'm going to give the perspective of the experience of the small states, but I'm also going to try to bring some optimism in because I also want to be able to go home and sleep tonight without crying. And so Nick started with a little bit of a story about the sea and the carcass of the fish. So I thought maybe I'll give a different maritime analogy that might be a bit more positive. And at this time of year, we're thinking about Chinese New Year. And for those who know, the very famous story of how they chose the order of the zodiac was all the animals got together and had a race, and whoever got to the other side first would be the one that, starts off the year. And it wasn't the ox, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful, that made it across first. It was actually the rat who sat on the back of the ox and then jumped off on the other side. And I like to think about this story because it always makes me think of how the smallest and those who seem the most vulnerable can often actually be the most agile and strategic, even in times that seem like the biggest crisis. And so we're talking about what Trump 2.0 means for European security. And of course, we're starting off in Washington, but I'd also like to take us to other parts of Europe. And I'm thinking about Tallinn, where at the moment Estonia is spending over 3% of GDP on defense, or in Finland, which is only recently inside NATO, but is expanding its wartime strength to 280,000 troops, has one of the largest artillery forces in Europe, and is actually the place that all the other NATO member states are going to ask for lessons in societal resilience, because even before joining NATO, they've always been attuned to the importance of risk and danger on the border and the need to be prepared at all times. And so what are these states doing? It's not just about the numbers, it's about the strategy. And Christoph was talking about strategic objectives. And I think we're seeing that small states are acting already and have been for quite some time as if US guarantees could become conditional. But that is a bit of a shift, because even during Trump 1.0, we saw NATO budgets actually rose, US troops remained in Europe, and deterrence was being reinforced. So even as many were panicking during the first administration, we actually saw a shoring up of a lot of partnership. But Trump 2.0 feels different because the language and the behavior does seem to be shifting in the ways my colleague talked about. And cases like Venezuela and Greenland are seemingly changing the tone. They've reminded the world that this stalwart ally that many of the small states that are very super Atlanticist, as we call them, always looking to for support, is not even trying to disguise blatantly expansionist ambitions. And I do agree with my colleagues that for small states which rely on institutions and rules to soften the law of the jungle, a more transactional world does create a strategic dilemma. But it's not that we have completely lost this support. American engagement still does deter adversaries. The challenge is that when it's driven unilaterally rather than in concert with allies, it destabilizes the very order it once protected. The problem at the moment is not that burden sharing isn't happening, but it's that burden sharing is framed as a bill to be settled. Article 5 is discussed in terms of compliance. Support for Ukraine, as Ruth was saying, becomes politically negotiable. So credibility starts to shift, even if deployments do remain in place. So what are small states to do about this, and how are they responding? We've seen the Nordic states have intensified defense industrial cooperation. We're seeing more ad hoc groupings like the Joint Expeditionary Force becoming more operationally serious. The EU has accelerated joint ammunition procurement after discovering in 2023 that European stockpiles were dangerously thin, but they are also still very much working together. So we were just talking about Greenland, for instance, and we saw small states acting in coalition, de-escalating, working to anchor the discussion in international law and statements of sovereignty. When these crises break out, everybody wants sort of a dramatic outcome and what's going to happen next. And the best thing small states can do is make it very boring, make it very much about, well, you know, this is the law and we all just need to calm down. We need to work together. And yes, we will send troops there and we will, of course, we'll work together, because escalation does not work in the favor of small states. So my hope is actually that politics is going to get a lot more boring and less interesting for our Netflix screens. And as we saw, the outcome of Greenland was very much then a de-escalation and reaching an agreement. And there are some positives too. I mean, if you look at NATO in the last couple of years, well, it's expanded. It's expanded with the joining of Sweden and Finland, who joined precisely because Russia's war made neutrality in their strategic calculus untenable. And American forces still remain stationed across Poland, the Baltics, and Romania. So for now, the story isn't about abandonment. I'm less concerned, although I don't like to make predictions, that NATO will collapse entirely. It's more a problem of the volatility and the conditions that the alliance is going to come with. And now small states are really facing a dual exposure. We've got Russia to the east and unpredictability across the Atlantic. And that does affect risk calculations. It's likely to encourage greater hedging, so really looking to who other partners might be to step in and be a bit more reliable. And we haven't really talked at all about China yet. So I think that will be interesting for the discussion, whether there might be alternatives looming, deeper EU defense integration and greater regionalism. And so what are some of the points that I want to make that haven't come up yet? We're talking about Europe, and we've said the EU, we've said NATO. I do want to mention that the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has to remain part of the conversation and something that European partners should continue investing in supporting. It works in confidence building, arms control, monitoring, mediation, conflict early warning. Of course, a lot of this has deteriorated since the war in Ukraine, but the OSCE remains the only European security forum where Russia, Ukraine, EU members, the US, and neutrals are all sitting at the same table. So this makes it indispensable for de-escalation and keeping diplomatic channels alive, and could be better used to prepare the ground for any settlements. And finally, I think I'd like to make an important point as we talk about the role of different European countries in security, is we have to try to avoid talking about especially the small states, but all European states, as though they are a monolith with one approach. I mean, we're not sitting in the US where they often say Europe and don't differentiate. Here we know that different states have different perspectives and different priorities. Eastern states fixated on Russia, southern states on instability across the Mediterranean, neutrals on preserving channels for dialogue, and so on. But that diversity is what gives Europe strategic depth, because it allows for states to specialize, some in deterrence, some in diplomacy, some in humanitarian assistance or energy security. And this is why I want to close with making a point about the neutrals, because we tend to talk about European security and focus a lot on the hard power, the ramping up of defense capability, and NATO. But there is also a very particular space for the contribution of neutral states like Malta, Ireland, Austria, and Switzerland in ensuring humanitarian access, peace mediation, and moral authority. To give just one historical example, during the Arab Spring, when the crisis broke out in Libya, the British and French sent in planes. I'm not going to talk about that operation, but Malta, which was a neutral country, became the staging hub for all humanitarian relief efforts. So, sending in water, taking out the wounded, taking out expatriates, providing humanitarian assistance that was only allowed because it was coming from a neutral country. And so I have some concerns when we talk about European security as though NATO and the EU should become one institution or all states should be following the same kind of strategy, because I always think of a healthy ecosystem a bit like the human body. You wouldn't say we need 3 hearts or 10 lungs, right? You'd say each part has its role to play. And I think if we start thinking about the kind of functional specialization that different states can have, it can help us think differently about the kinds of relationships states can have with the US, with Russia, with each other, and maybe give us a little bit more optimism by seeing diversity as a source of strength.
Thank you very much, Hilary and everybody. So, yes, questions from the audience. My colleague Russell is walking around with a microphone. I would say we're going to collect 3 to start with. If you want to briefly introduce yourself and say maybe who your question is for, and then let's take it from there. The lady in green.
I already know you're looking at me, Professor. It's okay. You know what question I'm going to ask, It's a question to all of you on the panel, as much as I want to ask so many more. I just came back from Kiev. The only upper hand we have is that it didn't rain. It rained missiles, but that's a slightly different, that's an us problem. My question was about the discussions of cynicism and the changing vibes, I guess I'll put it that way, of international politics. We had Carney pointing out that cynicism existed before, it just had a different branding. Just look at EU policy. I want to just specifically focus on the EU here. Between 2014 to 2022, 2008, 2004, 1993, and 1991 and 1990s. Everybody were like, hey, let's not rock the boat, let's try to stay friends with Russia, and Georgia and Ukraine and everybody else just have to deal with it. Is perhaps the uncomfortable truth, and this is not my point of view, but I'm playing the devil's advocate, is that Europe is now just more upfront forced to play hardball, both domestically and actually dealing with I forgot the word from Ukrainian. Let's put it that way, traitors, but I'm putting with local actors in the EU that actively ruin European sovereignty and help Europe's enemies. And what do you do also with the public that is increasingly becoming anti-Ukrainian, that perhaps doesn't want to see more taxes raised to help Ukraine or even help increase domestic military spending? Although I do agree that, it's more about spending smart rather than spending more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe the lady in the back, Wouter, can you see over here? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Anna Matveeva, King's College London, Russia Institute. I have a couple of quick questions. One is to Nicholas. Europe is criticized from various angles. If some of this criticism is fair, what would be one fundamental change which Europe should make? Is there one sort of hard lesson which we Europeans have to take from it? And to Ruth, I would like to say that I do not share your opinion that Trump seeks catastrophic surrender of Ukraine. I think that what is happening, his rhetoric is what it is. But if we take the cold actions, they are driving in the opposite direction. There is zero improvement in bilateral Russia-US relations. Russian diplomats do not have access to diplomatic property in the United States. Trump administration has taken quite effective steps to squeeze Russia further out of energy markets. Rosneft, Lukoil have to part with their assets. It's a big blow for them, for the countries where they have these assets. India, again, now more or less, confirming that they're not going to buy Russian oil. These are kind of big losses, and maybe there's more to come. So far, rhetoric is red carpet, but actions are quite different.
Thank you very much. And finally, here in front, the lady here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating panel. Thea Tutberidze, War Studies final year PhD candidate. First of all, before I ask the question, I want to make a few little comments. Who knows Russia? Nobody believes Russia's diplomacy works with Russia. So my question is, do you think in the current geopolitical circumstances, Britain can take leadership in Europe? Because historically, there are quite lots of signs which can give this hope. Because, and another question is, do you think the current government in the UK has strategic objectives in this case, and what is objective from the UK's government? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe, Ruth, would you like to start?
Sure.
You're okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be quick. On the issue of on the issue of an increasingly anti-Ukrainian public and one that may be hostile to public spending on defence. I'm not sure in the UK that that's the case, that we have an increasingly anti-Ukrainian public. That's not what polling shows. It may be the case in other parts of Europe. On defence spending, it's about communication, I think. And this is something that policymakers have been talking about for months, and I think it's something that they are now finally actually starting to recognise they need to act on. They need to communicate the importance of defence spending because they need to communicate what the alternatives are, and they're not great, right? Anna, unsurprisingly, I don't agree with you, as ever, right? Everything that we can see, everything that the US government have done in relation to Ukraine has been based on the idea that they will give in, that they will give up. They have made no demands of Russia. The only area where they have put any pressure on Russia at all has been on energy, but this, I think, is not at all to do with Ukraine. It's to do with the preoccupation with energy markets that the Trump administration has always had, that we can also see in Venezuela. I think in this instance, they're prepared to sacrifice their relationship with Russia in order to benefit on energy. And I mean, the fact that they haven't been successful in realigning effectively with Russia, the fact that they haven't got Ukraine to capitulate, the fact that they haven't got Europe to sign up to an insane 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, in which Russia is readmitted to the G8 and they're recognized as a great power, and everyone signs up to the idea of a US-Russia energy kind of cooperation in the Arctic, or critical minerals cooperation in the Arctic, all of which are in the apparently American peace plan for Ukraine. The fact that hasn't worked isn't because they don't want it, it's because they haven't been successful. That's a different point. Right? I'll stop.
Yeah. Nick, did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I'm still thinking through my answer, but let me answer them in a kind of reverse order. So, starting with the question of strategic objectives, right, for the UK's strategic objectives. So, I think, clearly we've made an absolutely massive historic mistake recently, right? And we sort of partnered up with a giant, angry, slightly insane gorilla, right, rather than our neighbors, right? It was a really massive strategic error, right? And it's just clearly a problem, right? So obviously Britain has a particular set of strategic challenges, right, which are to do with what it does with an enormous geopolitical mistake it just made. Right? This ties into the other elements, which are to do with cynicism and to do with what's the kind of fair criticism. So Europe has, I think, and Britain included, right? Europe has problems which are internal, which sit at the root of our engagement with international relations, right? Sort of an erosion of trust in democracy, an erosion of trust in the social contract, and a kind of general sense after a whole series of domestic decisions that the society is not on the side of large chunks of that population, right? And as a consequence that the problems that need to be resolved are outside somewhere and they require some form of transformative change to the way in which we run. So, the question of our cynicism in terms of geopolitics, we put up with a lot of anti-democratic behaviors externally, and some of those have now boomeranged back, and we're seeing them within our own societies, right? So I think a lot of the solution to how we think is about how we think about democracy and how we attempt to restore trust, which is a point that Christoph has said. I'm not sure if there's one simple change, unfortunately, that we could make, but I mean, for Britain, clearly we need to be with Europe, right? Obviously. I mean, this seems like a no-brainer. For the rest of Europe, I think it has a much more complicated problem, which is to do with the way in which foreign policy paradigms play through EU institutions and how they come into contact with national politics in the domestic states. And that is far from an easy square to circle, because the EU foreign policy paradigm and the external action services is of a particular kind, right? And it doesn't perfectly gel with the competing different kinds of geopolitical narratives playing out across Europe. So there isn't a simple solution for Europe either.
Did you want to add?
I could add something short.
Yeah.
I'd add a point on the question about public sentiment, how to keep them pro-Ukrainian and spending smart. I think and my answer will again be from the perspective of the small states to give a different angle. And I think we are seeing steps in the right direction. In 2014, only 3 NATO countries were spending the required 2% of GDP on NATO contributions. Fast forward 10 years to 2024 and over 20 do. So we're seeing spending going up. We're seeing a lot of that going towards support and preparation to be able to stand in support of Ukraine. And for small states, you have to as well, because you don't want to have the same experience, which is the experience of the frontline states being concerned that they'll be next, but B, even from neutral states and others, standing up for that moral imperative that the rule of sovereignty is absolute, because even if it's not Russia, it could be somewhere else. And that's why you see countries like Belize and others that are so far away, small states in other places, that are being very vocal against what is happening in the region. And on the point about the UK leading in Europe today, I actually think we do see UK leadership on a lot of these issues, even as we're tend to be more critical from where we're sitting. But whatever people think of Boris Johnson, his response on the Ukraine was considered in Europe to be very strong from the outset and set the tone. And the UK is very much leading in a lot of the analysis and response to support for Ukraine and training to Ukrainian soldiers, but even more broadly, I mean, our government is a different kind of government politically to the US government, and we see very strategically the way that there was the royal visit that created soft power and support, and he really spoke to Trump's love of pageantry, but using the royal family to kind of stroke that ego and generate some public support where politically there might have been a bit more tension. So I think that's a very interesting strategic move that we're seeing as well. And the last thing that I would say to connect the two is we're still seeing UK leading support not only on Ukraine and trying to bridge with the US, but in terms of trying to keep climate change on the international agenda, because we're talking about security and the relationship with the US almost exclusively, again, in hard power terms. But, Trump has also left many of the climate organizations, is trying to roll back on climate commitments. And the UK is the place that held the Glasgow COP and has always been trying to reassert itself as a bit more of a convening power on climate, is still trying to keep that conversation happening. And I think that's very important at a time when the response to Ukraine is causing certain states to say, well, we're rolling back on energy and we can't necessarily meet all our climate commitments because of defense. So we need all of these conversations to be happening at the same time. And I think the UK is one of the few places where there is an effort to try and keep all those conversations in the room and not just say, well, it's only defense or it's only climate or it's only what we need to do in relation to the US.
Yes. So on getting public support for greater investment in capabilities, I think one of the problems is that too many people are talking about the conflict in Ukraine and talking about the problem being the conflict or the war in Ukraine. As I said earlier, the problem is Russian imperialism, and it's a threat not just to Ukraine, it's a threat to the whole of Europe. There are acts of sabotage, there are cyber attacks, there are disinformation operations. It's no longer peace across Europe, and Russia, with the support of China, is trying to polarize societies, trying to undermine trust in governments, and that threat is not going away if there is a peace deal tomorrow. That threat may actually go bigger because Russia will have spare resources to mobilize again. So I think it's very important that we're talking about the threat in the right way and talking about the strategic goal in the right way and not talk about conflict in Ukraine. Secondly, I think in order to convince ourselves, make the case for more spending, is that you don't just talk about this is about defense, it's also about the modernization of the state. It's about modernization of the infrastructure. It's about new technologies. It's about economic growth. It's about jobs. So if you don't just talk about, oh, we need to buy more weapons, but we talk about making society, making institutions, making industry more capable and resilient, then I think you have a much better case for taking the public with you, because then it's not just about, oh, we're spending all that money to avoid a risk. We're spending all that money to become more resilient and influential in international affairs more broadly. So I think we need to have a kind of strategic, hopeful narrative that goes with that spending, not just, oh, well, we need to avoid that Russia attacks us tomorrow. So that on the public side. On flexibility, I think the EU has learned through recent years of crisis management to deal with the problem of national vetoes. Sometimes it's about threatening to do it outside the EU framework. In many ways, countries like Hungary are now kind of on the outside, and many of the EU's foreign policy declarations are on behalf of the EU 26. If you read the text, it's the EU speaking as the 26, not the 27. You've seen it with the Russian freeze of assets, where the EU was kind of moving forward without 3 member states, enhanced cooperation. So you get these flexibility arrangements for the EU to move forward despite potentially national vetoes. So I think there's some hope there, but I do think sometimes you do need to have smaller groupings of states that are still associated with the EU, but who can be a bit more bold, a bit more courageous, a bit more ambitious. And I think that's what is needed with regard to Russia. And I think the big contribution of the UK is that it is more tolerant of risk. And I think that has been a big problem with Western support for Ukraine, because we had all these restrictions on how missiles can be used. We had all this kind of reluctance to make Russia desperate. So I think a bit more risk-taking is needed, and the UK is more risk-tolerant. The problem with the UK is that it's no longer spending enough, and that it is Germany which has been doubling its defense budget. So in a sense, it is Germany now that is the leader when it comes to defense, and that is not without problem, because you have a historical problem with regard to Germany. So there's an issue of trust now within Europe about, kind of accommodating these shifts in power and kind of making sure that France, the UK, Germany, and the Nordics and the Baltics are kind of pulling in all one direction, rather than kind of starting to distrust each other and start to be a bit jealous because one country is spending and the others are not. So I think that's a big challenge politically, to keep everyone kind of solidaristic in going in one direction.
Okay, so we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but there is going to be more time to talk over drinks and a few nibbles. That's upstairs on the first floor opposite the cafeteria. So you get out of the Great Hall, go upstairs and take a right. And there we have a few drinks, and you can ask some more questions, I hope. Sorry about that, but there was so much to say. So big thank you to all panelists here. and to all of you for choosing to spend your Monday night here with us to listen to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Sherry.